Hello and welcome to our tech journey. Fresh after the rebrand. With me today, Adrian, Jonathan, and Camilla, hopefully rejoining us very soon. Welcome, welcome. How's everybody doing?
Fine. I'm very happy to have Jonathan here today. Jonathan
I'm
was
happy to be here today too.
yeah. So you was basically no, I was the guest on your show on Tiny DevOps about a year ago or something like that.
Yeah.
And I always wish to have you on one of ours as well.
Oh,
And here you are about your, at least it was your favorite topic back then. So is it still a favorite topic of yours?
yeah. I love talking about skiing.
Yeah, exactly. In
Yes, so
summer, skiing in summer. How can
today
we
is
actually
all
do
about
that?
skiing.
Getting snow on the track, right? So
Exactly.
he's the man for this.
Yeah, Jonathan and I also had an episode on the original YouTube channel. If you're watching this on YouTube Live, it used to be called the Technologist Podcast. Had a show called the Technologist Podcast, but it was a bit too interviewy for me, and I really I very much prefer this kind of panel conversation. So the agenda for today is test-driven development. I just kicked off sort of a little bit of research for the past few months. I've been talking a lot about test-driven development, blah 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 blah. It became an echo chamber, and then I think we just sort of lost the plot. And I took a break from just posting about TDD, and I really wanted to delve into the research. I focused more on coaching TDD, focused more on just understand like what the heck is going on. Like if it's so good, why is everybody resisting it? Like that was sort of my understanding. You and I spoke on it briefly as well in our pod, and I believe the two of you did also discuss it when you had your episode. So the agenda for today is TDD adoption from scratch. So how to adopt it in a fresh project versus like a messy or legacy project. Number two is impact on engineering culture. So trying to figure out, okay, is this for us? Is this not for us? Is it benign and neutral, or is it just a lot of work and it slow us down? And number three, how does how does TDD impact the sort of emotional, psychological state of the team? Like, does it impact well-being in some way? Does it impact productivity? Kent Beck often mentions that the reason he reinvented and wrote about TDD was, sorry, not reinvented, rediscovered and wrote about TDD was to give developers a means of how to manage their own anxiety, where when they were afraid to release the production. So that's something we'll cover today. I just sent out a newsletter post with all of the data from the survey that we'll be referencing today. And there's also a few LinkedIn polls still running if you'd like to participate in that. But for the context of this conversation, we'll present everything on screen that we'll be talking about. Uh, Jonathan, from your side, perhaps, the last time we spoke, you said you don't talk about 3D as often anymore.
Hmm.
There are now there's more nuance to when you adopt it and how you adopt it and on what kind of projects you use it, especially now as a consultant. What's
So
your
yeah,
2023 take on TDD?
TDD is a hot button issue, which is one reason I don't talk about it as much. I mean, maybe I should preface like probably everything I'm going to say in this entire chat today with I have a concept of what TDD is and should be that I
Mm-hmm.
think is really important. But a lot of people have different conceptions of what TDD is, and so often when I talk about TDD and I say one thing, I say TDD is blue. Someone else hears TDD is green, and they're like, "No, that's wrong. I'm not going to do that."
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same. We have the same problem with when we talk about agile or MVPs or a thousand other things. These terms, DevOps. These terms just sort of take on their own life, and everybody has their own conception of what it is. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's one reason I don't talk about it as much. I mean, I'm happy to talk about it one on one with somebody's honestly talking interested in learning my perspective.
Yeah.
But the hot takes and stuff, everybody should do TDD, or if you're not doing TDD, you're stupid. That sort of stuff. I
Mm-hmm.
don't see it as constructive or helpful, so I kind of shy away from that. Whereas maybe a younger, less mature version of myself would have just jumped on that bandwagon.
Okay, so TDD is one of those topics that can quickly result in flame wars on
Yeah,
social media and forums and Reddit. It's you mentioned TDD, like you should be doing TDD, or stop mentioning TDD, or
hmm,
stop telling me I'm a lousy professional if I don't do TDD. So, and I think sort of the vitriol from that comes from I think the way that sort of Uncle Bob popularized TDD in his
yeah,
workshops and in his incorporated it into his stage persona. because he's very much assertive and very strict about it. In contrast to Kent Beck, for example, who says, this is what I call it. I sort of wrote the book, so I have dibs on the phrase, and this is what it means.
Yeah.
And he just recently posted a article about it, about canon TDD. Like, what is the canonical meaning of the word TDD? Because people seem to mix it up with red-green refactor, but really TDD has 4 steps, at least from the original interpretation, which is write a test plan, decide as a team which test to tackle first, then write the test, see it fail so that you understand whether it's presenting you an impactful message, implement it, and then refactor in case you've created a mess. Now that it's working, use the safety net to refactor as much as is necessary for you to make a benevolent next step towards the next test. Like, that's the sort of gist of it. But this whole game doesn't make sense in absence of that test list, because the test list is project management. That's what a lot of TDD practitioners miss. Is that TDD comes, that test list says, oh, this is a complex feature. There's 100 tests we need to write. We need to start with this one, with number 47. This is the most important one to start with because it's the simplest one that opens up all the pathways towards the other complexity. Like, that's the really important step. And a lot of practitioners skip that. And if you skip that, then you're tackling the entire complexity in one go, and suddenly you're expecting TDD to perform magic.
I remember reading that, and it was a little bit surprising to me, partly due to timing. I had just had a conversation on a Slack channel maybe 2 weeks ago with someone who was proposing, having a long predefined list of tests, and then how do they do TDD, and got a lot of pushback from people like, that's not the right way to do TDD. And, I even pushed back a little bit. So when I saw that from Kent, I was a little bit surprised because I've never intentionally done TDD that way. Now that's not to say I don't have a list of tests in mind when I start. I know what I want to do, but I usually take a slightly different approach, which is, okay, I know where I want to go. What's one concrete small step I can take to get that direction right now? Which I maybe that's the same thing, but I certainly don't like spend time coming up with a list of 100 tests I could write. I don't do that. Maybe I have 3 or 4 in mind, and I pick one. So I don't know. Maybe Kent would tell me I'm doing it wrong, but that's. I certainly haven't followed the letter of that prescription, and I've seen a lot of benefit.
I just want to be very precise in our terminology today. Like, you're not doing it wrong. You're not doing it the way he defines it. Like, that's it doesn't mean that it's wrong. Because I did find myself doing it that way that Kent describes, and I, for example, I always had this sort of bias. Like, I didn't understand that certain developers weren't doing it. So there were some obvious gaps in our understanding. So we had an assumption stack, and it didn't match for certain procedures. And we also already have a lot of useful comments in chat. So Jeff mentions the post. Yeah, this is the original post. This is from this week, I believe. And there's apparently a Mastodon conversation. I believe this is a thread, right? Whatever the equivalent of that is. And Jeff mentions, a number of us disagreed about the need for write a list being needed. So I disagree. The need to write a list into the code base, I don't think is necessary. Like, it doesn't say you need to write, comments or create a README and write the list of tests. Like, for me, if your, let's say, Jira tickets express testability, that is also enough. Right? So if you have, at a very vague level, we want to test that this one feature has these 7 functionalities, and these 7 functionalities have these 5 tests each, and right now we're exploring one of the 7. That, to me, that is also sufficient, as long as the team sort of can keep something of, let's say, a holistic unit that is not too large in their head. So the point isn't that you write 100. The point is that you make some kind of decision of this or that. At least that was my understanding.
So let's break this down with an example. Let's suppose we're building a Fibonacci calculator. What kinds of what would this list of tests look like? Would the list of tests be, okay, position 1 returns 1, position 2 returns 1, position 3 returns 2, and so on? And if so, that list is sort of predefined. Just by the definition of the problem. We certainly don't need to go down and write down the first 100 iterations of that. We kind of have it in mind already. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. Is I already have I have this list sort of implicitly in mind, but I rarely go to the effort. Sometimes, depending on what I'm doing, but I rarely go to the effort of like articulating it in writing, whether it's Jira tickets or a README or Post-it notes. I rarely do that. Sometimes, but rarely.
Okay, Jeff says, no, we don't just tackle a list of hundreds of tests, and we just start with a simple and obvious test.
Jeff and I are on the same page here.
Yeah, so if it's simple and obvious, I would say no point writing a list.
Yeah.
I think I would write a list when there is. So Fibonacci is an example where the algorithm itself only does one. It only has one path of operation, and that path is simply complicated. Like it has steps to it, but they are linearly progressing. If I was writing an event model, that event model would have multiple elements, but they all flow linearly without changing direction. There's no loop, there's no reentry, there's no branching logic. Loop or reentry in the sense that the user can stop and decide to do something else, right? So there is no user-initiated action that can sort of branch the usage scenario. I would say when the usage scenario can branch because you have something of a UI element, you perform something, you present another UI element, you perform something, you present another UI element. I think that is when I would really start writing the test of, okay, which of these human interaction levels still should we use as our step one? Which of these should we sort of terminate on? Should we assume that it is part of a unit, not part of a unit? I think that's a meaningful conversation, but not in the context of Fibonacci. I think in the context of Fibonacci, the list itself is so simple that it is implicit. I think we agree on that with Jeff, with yourself. For the bowling game, I start with all the rolls, miss all the pins, total score 0. I agree. Right, so for the bowling game, I would write down a list just to see, yes, this one actually does make sense to start with. So I would have a list of maybe 4 tests, and I would say, okay, I'm starting with this one. Because I need to define what a strike is, but I can't define a strike until I have a concept of a roll or a miss or a hit or pins or the stage.
But this is already going a little bit into the direction of integration tests.
That's the second aspect, yes. So
this is what so when you want to do TDD in the idea of unit or component tests, it becomes complicated to use a list, because then you go more and more into the need of basically everything already in place. And then you can say what's next. And for me, this is more a form of end-to-end test than really, writing a test for a component, function, or method, or something like that.
I usually follow the zombie methodology here. Zombie being 0, 1, many, boundaries, integration, and exceptions, right? So that would be sort of the topology of this is the kinds of problems, and I want to solve them with tests in this order, right? So Jeff mentions Fibonacci 0 is 0. This would be the Z of zombie. I want the 0 of iteration of something. Does it make sense to give no arguments? Does it make sense to make all arguments null? Does it make sense to make all arguments their default numeric value if they're integers, floats, etc.? That is, let's say, what I would start with. I didn't really prepare to talk about zombies, so I don't wanna create too much of a tangent. But Adrian, you mentioned something very important there regarding when you're writing a test. I think one of the important litmus tests is that you're writing a test that expresses behavior. So the logical, the business oriented side of behavior, not how you'll implement it. I think a lot of 3D practitioners start from the other perspective. They have legacy code or they have some algorithm they want to implement, and then they ask, okay, what test do I need to trick myself of thinking of failing to have so that I can then create this algorithm that I've already decided how to implement? And usually engineers start learning 3D that way, and it's just a whole mess. Because they're not really, they never zoom out to the point where they actually think about the business problem, they actually think about the logical boundary of what the feature is expressing with terminology from the user's perspective, rather than implementation, right? So it should be design, it should be the feature, it should be the product being tested. It should be our assumption stack around the product, not so much to how it's being implemented. I think that's That's one of the most abstract things in TDD, and that's the hard stuff. A lot of people think that that's the magic that TDD will somehow sort of design itself. That you just, like you're the computer, and TDD is ChatGPT, and it tells you what to write. And I think TDD has some kind of like magic to it that is being sort of romanticized in social media.
I think this is a good point to point out that TDD isn't magic. TDD is a discipline, and just like brushing your teeth or doing push-ups or whatever disciplines you might have in your life to make you a better person in whatever aspect. There's no magic involved. It's just something to help keep you on track. If you need to set an alarm every morning to go to the gym, setting an alarm isn't what makes you lose weight or build muscle mass. It's the discipline that gets you there. TDD is the discipline to get you to good code. It doesn't magically create good code for you. It helps you. It's a framework in which to force or encourage you to think about things in useful ways, which is what you're talking about here. I've been doing TDD today, and one of the challenges that I hit a couple times today was, okay, I know I need to add this capability. At what level of my application can I put a test that will prove that it's not there yet, and that it is there once I add it? And sometimes at least I have the tendency to think in the micro, like, okay, I'm adding a field to a log, so I'm going to add a test to my logger, but maybe that's the wrong place. Maybe I need to add a test to my my router or my middleware or something. Whatever exposes, whatever calls that logger. Maybe that's the first test I write. It's more of an integration test or something. That's not to say I wouldn't maybe later add a test at a lower level, but if that's not where my functionality is being exposed, then putting that test in the wrong part of the code isn't helping me. So that's TDD. The magic that happened today for me wasn't that I wrote tests first. The magic that happened was that I thought about, where does this test belong so that I can prove that my behavior is correct? Because if I hadn't done TDD, I probably would have written the functionality. It might have even been correct, and I might have pushed it up, and it might have been fine. But then in a month, when somebody refactors something and it's not the same way, maybe things fall through the cracks. So TDD is a discipline to help you think about things and do things in a useful order. It doesn't magically design your code for you. That's one of the biggest fallacies I hear people complain about. Yeah. And if somebody is telling you that TDD makes your code better magically, I would say they're wrong. It doesn't. There's no magic.
I would express TDD from I coach this a lot, and we often split hairs on this because it does always become, in coaching sessions, it always becomes a philosophical discussion. Like we always spend at least 1 hour going through this philosophy. And the analogy, the metaphor that I like to use is, I say, if we're solving a math test, you and I will solve the math test differently. The point of TDD is that it is a discipline that will grade your work and my work equally. That's the point. So that there is a test to say how my score is being evaluated. Like, there is a procedure. There are rules in place. The professor, the teacher won't suddenly decide that you have different rules and you'll get more points for worse answers compared to me. The point is that there is a methodology to how it is being evaluated that is being written down as part of the let's say, the first implementation of writing the actual solution to the problem. I think that's the main area, and the criticism where a lot of people say they slowed down comes from this place of, well, they're just used to not writing the second thing down. So when you add this to the equation, they say, oh, this will make me slower. Because they just implicitly assume that, yeah, I have this thing implicitly in my head, or it's a Jira ticket, and then I write it down, and then I delete this. I move this into that other thing. And then somebody says, yeah, this is not good enough, confirm, commit, push, and now I only have the artifact that says what were the answers. I don't have the test anymore. I don't have the grading criteria. I don't have the context of what the grading criteria was. I only have the solved problem. I might not even have the questions anymore. I just have the answers. And sort of that's the answers in this context, in this metaphor, is the implementation. And that is the least useful bit about software, because it only works in one moment in time. You upgrade some module, some dependency, it might not be working anymore. You deploy it on a different kind of server, it might not be working on anymore. You might even deploy it on the cloud in some other availability zone. It might not be working anymore because maybe some dependency changed.
Yeah.
But if you haven't captured what it means exactly to express what the problem was, then the implementation can never really express itself of, oh, this is what I'm a fit for. This solution is a fit for this question. Like if those two pieces are not together, then you always have this human element necessary of some engineer needs to be responsible for what this piece of code does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think you should be able to. I wouldn't say that a single person is responsible for a test. So maybe if you meant that,
because a test, no, but the implementation, let's say,
the implementation
in absence of tests. Yes, in absence of tests, in that moment, but at least one human responsible to verify or to understand what this piece of code is doing.
Yeah, but
that's easy. That's the QA people.
Yeah,
until they leave the company, and then you get
especially or the user when he's testing. But no, but in reality, it's like that. You write the test. You are basically in the red cycle until you get green. And on that point, then you push on some point, and on that point, it's basically the responsibility of the entire team. So I don't know that in our teams that you just write a function and no one else is working on that function in the future. It is more like, especially when you start to refactor things or you change something, in the interface or types or something like that, you often get back to that one, or APIs, for API results. And then you definitely need to be, this is, I think, the original idea of TDD, to write documentation of this stuff before you actually implement it. So it is well possible for the team to take responsibility of that as well. So if you push something, you cannot just run your test for the function you're working on at the moment. Before you activate the CI/CD pipeline, you need to run the entire thing and make sure that your changes doesn't affect other tests.
So you get immediate feedback.
Exactly.
You can fix a defect before it goes into the mainline pipeline.
Yeah.
Prior to starting work on something
if it's
else.
possible. So there are environments where it's impossible, but if it's possible, so definition of done before you actually push is that the tests are green for you on your machine. All tests, all available tests. So this is the reason why I don't think a list is necessary, because you need to run any tests anyway, and they should, I think, an exception is maybe not the end-to-end test. So I wouldn't say that the end-to-end test is really necessary, because end-to-end tests can take very long. They can be flaky, and they can prevent you from actually pushing anything. So continuous delivery could be threatened by end-to-end tests if they are running for too long.
Agreed.
So unit tests, let's say some smaller tests, let's say below integration level, they should be tested before pushing. This is what I think
it's a great response to Jeff's comment as well. This idea of unit versus integration. I think we obsess too much about this idea of what the separation is, about a testing pyramid. The whole point is that whatever you call it, it's meant for the developer. It's creating feedback for the developer who just committed something that it's not okay, right? So I've seen the word developer test being used. Like whatever you call it, it will run in process, ideally without connecting to the internet, and it will run a test, and it will give you immediate feedback. So it will run fast. Like that's the only criteria. That I can commit something, I'm typing something, and at the same speed as Google would, as Gmail would autocorrect me on a typo, the test will tell me whether I've messed up something about my understanding of the problem.
Okay, I just displayed from Wade a question, because he already tried that via YouTube, and maybe he was thinking that we don't see it.
Commented on YouTube, and
yes. So Jeff, we will get to your other things. You have written several other comments.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Chronology of Wade's questions. He had multiple. So this is the first one. Is TDD just another fad in technology? Question: does TDD result in more stable, tighter, safer, more secure code? How do you know? So I did. Jonathan, do you want to take this?
Sure. We'll do the first one first. Is it a fad? No. In a word, no. It's been around since at least the 50s.
Yeah.
So if it's a fad, it's a longer lived fad than the internet so far. So no, I don't think it's a fad. Is the term a fad? Maybe. I don't care if you call it TDD. That's like I said earlier, the term is confusing anyway.
Good point.
But the practice that I do, that many other people do, is not going away. I don't think ever. I don't think even AI is going to make it go away. It might make it more prevalent.
Actually, yes, yeah.
But no, I don't think it's a fad. I think that emphatic no. There's no way it's a fad. Does it result in more stable, tighter, safer, more secure code? Maybe, probably. But
I have some
by
data on that,
accident.
if you don't mind me putting it on the screen, because I did run a survey on this, and this was sort of the core idea. So does it create more secure code? I would say no, but it does enable a team to do so. So there's an indirect benefit.
I might push back a little bit on that. I think it forces you to think about security that you otherwise wouldn't. So in that sense, it can produce more secure code. It's not going to make you more aware of like security vulnerabilities, but it will force you to think about how your code is being executed.
Yeah. So for
in that sense, it might.
For example, if your tests capture your security SLAs, then yes. Right? So if you had a testing-oriented way of describing your security SLAs. But if you're in a kind of company where you say, oh, this is our thing, it has tests, but on a local dev machine, it runs on HTTP, not HTTPS, and there's a sort of little proxy to bypass all the security things because we hate logging in for the integration tests, then it doesn't really do anything. It doesn't make it worse or better, but it definitely doesn't enable you to write more secure code. Like that is still, to answer Wade, that is still the responsibility of the developer. Like it's a discipline. Like it doesn't bring security. It enables a engineer who wants to build security to build it faster, more safely, or at least to build it in a way that represents the business benefits to build on security into a product rather than doing it sort of in isolation. But then again,
I think
the test might be just. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think TDD helps with security in kind of the same way that, like, it gives you a new perspective on your code, and that's going to expose some security vulnerabilities. But that's it.
Yes.
That's all it's going to do. If you're testing your logger and you see there's a password being logged, you're going to see that with TDD that you might not see otherwise. That sort of thing. But it's almost an accidental benefit. That's not the point. I don't do TDD to create secure code. I learn about security to create secure code.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not, TDD isn't designing anything. TDD isn't making anything more secure. It's the engineer's responsibility to do that. The point of TDD is to say, if I do happen to do that, can I write a test for it? Like, if the security effort requires code being written, can that code be test written? So, can that code be test covered? If we're in an environment where let's say our project is such a mess that we can't, then I will be really concerned. Why not? And TDD might not help you do that, but TDD might give you a strong signal that, hey, it's a blue bar in this chart. The difficulty to writing tests in our code base is really high. So if security causes us to think that way, then that might permeate to other problems. That's a sort of way of how I sort of holistically think it. It's more of an extreme programming practice, right? So if somebody in the business said, we need to be secure or we can't launch, that's a business requirement. It's worth test covering it. I wouldn't willy-nilly just turn off SSL on a production server. Like, I would want the test to tell me, hey, it's turned off by
You
accident.
can definitely test security requirements with TDD.
Exactly.
But I wouldn't just like tell my team to go do TDD and then tell the auditors, oh yeah, we're secure, we do TDD.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's a good.
Do we want to spend time on the other aspects there, like more stable, tighter?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know exactly how to.
Let's do some questions before we have some audience questions, and then go to the next aspects. So we have.
Also, just a small update. Camilla has some technical issues. She won't be able to join us today.
Yeah.
I love this question.
So let me try to Abdunur.
Yeah, read it.
How can we conduct end-to-end testing without causing a bottleneck in time to market? It's not TDD specific per se. Adrian, you were about to answer it.
Not really, but I can. So I can give my aspects to it because this is a question. I think we had that question today during the day when we were talking about tests, and it's always this idea of do tests in general keep you basically away from deploying fast. So does it hinder you to actually get to the market? So people say we might not need tests in order to deliver more. Or other reasons like we don't have budget for this or this kind of stuff. And I think this question is a little bit based on that one, based on that aspect. So especially end-to-end testing, so we mentioned that, can cause a bottleneck because I think it can. So if you have let's say you have a little Jamstack app, a small thing for a startup, an end-to-end test is maybe done in 2 to 3 minutes. That's okay. So it is. No, you could even run it as a post job of your CI/CD pipeline and have no problems with that. But if you have those traditional legacy systems where you have first of all flaky tests, so you don't know the outcome, so they run for 30 minutes. And on minute 29, they break. So you basically cannot put them into a CI/CD pipeline as an inline thing. So in my opinion, you should not do this because this then will cause more problems than it actually brings benefits. And so does it affect? So yes, I would say from my side. So I'm curious what Jonathan is saying now. But in my opinion, end-to-end test should be something which is more to let's say it's more aligned to the original QA aspect, so which we know from the past, like someone else is running that, or the developers are running that asynchronously to the development to take a look at everything is still right, or maybe they are run against the staging system, and when they are then basically green, they are automatically going to production. That could be a scenario as well. But if done wrong or very long testing scenarios, it can be a bottleneck, especially when they are very flaky, because you have integrated many systems together which are inconsistent or out of different ages. Like let's say a 10 years old or 20 years old mainframe system and let's say combined with a WordPress system and some other new microservice stuff in the cloud, then you might get problems. So I'm done with that now. But Jonathan, what do you think about what I just said?
I agree with what you said. I would be a little bit more on the nose about it. My direct answer to the question is, how can we conduct end-to-end tests without causing a bottleneck? Is you can't.
You can't.
Don't do
end-to-end testing. Is always going to be wasteful and harmful.
I mean, that's not to say you should do literally zero end-to-end testing, but it should be an absolute minority. Every end-to-end test should be a signal that you need better integration and unit tests.
Exactly.
I don't want to sound magical, like you're a bad person if you have end-to-end tests. That's not what I mean, and that you should switch tomorrow. It's a process, but use that as a signal to move towards improvement.
End-to-end testing is the equivalent of getting a giant industrial crane to lift something, right? So you better have a real large problem, right? If you're just lifting a 10 kilogram
analogy.
box,
I mean, that's fine. The analogy I would use is an end-to-end test is like saying, how long does it take? I just bought a brand new car. I want to test and make sure it works right. So I'm going to see if I can drive from Los Angeles to California in a certain number of hours.
And you'll do it yourself.
And the point is, the car might work perfectly, but you might not get there on time because of road construction or bad weather or 1,000 other things that are completely unrelated to your car.
So the reason end-to-end tests are expensive and unreliable is not because they are end-to-end tests, because there's something evil about the UI or the network layer, or
it is something evil there. There is something. There is.
No, but I would, because I talk to Nick Shoemaker a lot, and he does TDD on front end as well, no problem, right? So the whole point of end-to-end testing is not this. The issue with end-to-end tests, with a end-to-end test, is that it is the most extreme coupled version of a test. It has the most implementation coupling, of any form of test. That's why it's called end-to-end. It is significantly much more invasive in the way that you set it up compared to a unit test. Right?
It is
So
ideally integrated against entire production environment.
Exactly. And you might even be running it on production as a form of monitoring to do production level regression testing. Right? So but what makes it evil is what makes it expensive is not that you're
Evil is
testing with
okay.
a UI. You can test with a UI with a unit test, no problem.
Absolutely.
The problem is that you are connected to a lot of implementation details. And when we talk about the nature of TDD, we want to be testing the logical, the abstract design of behavior, of functionality. We don't want to test how it is implemented. Now, obviously, the implementation will come out. The implementation will be test covered, but the test should not use the terminology that was used to define the implementation. The test should be using the terminology and the framing of the problem in the context of the problem, not the solution that was created, because it is one of many thousand solutions that are possible.
I think this touches on a topic you asked me about earlier on, which is the nuance in which how I use TDD and don't use TDD sometimes. So I would say that there is one scenario where I do use and even advocate end-to-end style tests or something that might be similar, and that is when I'm coming onto a new project that doesn't have test coverage or very bad test coverage.
Like brownfield or legacy.
And I'm doing this on a project right now. I'll start by writing some end-to-end or nearly end-to-end tests. So just on this project, for example, I added a bunch of high-level API tests. They starts up the entire service and the database. It populates the database, runs migrations, and then runs API tests against it. It's slow. It takes a while to run. There's only about a dozen tests, and it takes a minute or two to run this dozen tests just because the startup is high. And they're kind of flaky, but I start that way, and my intention is to get rid of those tests eventually, but to start that way to give me the confidence to do the refactoring I need to get the rest of the system under test. So that's a scenario where I think it is appropriate to do some end-to-end tests, but it should be a temporary step towards the ideal.
I think one of the things that people miss is that there was this trend in hang on, we have a question that addresses this, so I want to hit two flies with one bird, or what's the so I want to talk about this idea of coverage, test coverage. I think somebody had a question on that. No?
I think we need to invite on some point Jeff Grigg, because he's writing so many comments that he can't just come online. It's less
yeah,
work
Jeff,
then.
if you want to come on stage right now, let us know. We might have to do some last minute sound testing. Oh my god, yeah, I'm trying to read everything Jeff posted, but I love it. Keep it coming. Okay, so Abdul, I think let us know if you answered your question or not. I just want to cover this argument from this question from the perspective of like working in a brownfield project that might not have tests. I would say it is very easy to get distracted by test coverage. See, in order to do DDD, in order to really focus on what this article highlights as being a core benefit, you need to minimize the amount of coverage you get with each test. I'm going to repeat that because this is a bit non-intuitive. You want to minimize the amount of coverage you get from each test. Because if one test gives you 1,000 lines of code of coverage, it's an end-to-end test. It's covering too much implementation. You should ideally only be covering something really small and really important that really expresses the behavior that you're trying to express with the test itself, with the problem solution. Now, with the problem definition, sorry. And one of the things we do when I'm coaching teams on TDD is this idea that if you're in a brownfield project, what we need to figure out is how to create. So we sort of had to suspend our sense of aesthetics and our sense of like clean way of working, because we need to introduce a testing scaffold that will allow us to isolate something to the degree that we can only cover this. I don't want to accidentally also cover all those other dependencies it has, because then I need to include it into the test setup. The more things I need to include into the test setup accidentally, the more code, the more lines of code in the test I'll need for lines of coverage. So ideally what I want is low amount of lines of code in the tests for a appropriate equivalent, let's say, of lines of code of coverage. What I don't want is a lot of fake coverage that require a lot of lines of code in the test. That's what an end-to-end test is. You open up, if you're using Cypress right now, open up any of your Cypress tests and tell me how many lines of code, something trivial like logging in. Like just tell me how many lines of code it is. How many Cypress tests do you have in your code base that are five lines of code or less? Like, that's the point. Like, we don't want to write this many lines of code to get this many lines of coverage. That's an anti-pattern. We want this many lines of code to get ideally a little bit more than that lines of coverage, right? So we are increasing the capital efficiency of the test we write. That's the point with TDD. So the point is that we are then forced to think about this problem in such a manner that we then, by design, make all units, at least to some agreed upon here depends on the team, agreed upon size and scale of, for this kind of test, for this size of test, I need very minimal setup. For this size of test, I need very minimal setup. That's what you sort of want to get across with all the teams that you're testing to then agree, okay, how much test setup do I need? If I'm using Kafka, if I'm using MySQL, if I'm using Redis, if I'm using Mongo, if I'm using ClickHouse, and then I have to bring all of that into my process, into my sort of Bitbucket pipeline, and then I have to spin them up and seed them with data, and then I run a large test that then has a lot of responsibilities. It's not very useful, because the amount of lines of code that I need to go through to make sure what is happening when it fails is not very useful. Mm-hmm. This sounds like Thomas. Is it Thomas? What we have on screen. It seems like something he would write. I think using test-driven design lets you think in a different way where you get more modularized code. Because of this, you are coding the code with a little bit more time, but it is more usable in other parts in a faster way. So I think TDD brings you more time to bring the product to the market, for example. What do you think about it? Jonathan?
I think there's an element of truth here that's generally overshadowed by a misconception. And I can elaborate on that.
Please.
I think if you're learning TDD and learning design, it will feel like it takes longer to write the code. And in some cases, it actually will take longer. You know, you could throw together a quick hack in an hour, and doing it with TDD and thinking it through takes 5 hours or something like that. You know, that can definitely happen.
Yeah.
As soon as it comes down to modifying that code, though, you'll be glad that you did TDD. Mm-hmm. It will make that part faster. It will make, which is probably the most important aspect of code. Can it be modified easily and safely? And TDD helps you ensure that. That's what modularization, as the question talks about, is important. Mm-hmm. As you become proficient in TDD and in design, this completely becomes untrue, I believe. Mm-hmm. I mean, that can take a while. It might take years to become truly proficient in all aspects of it. And you're still, even then, you're going to find corner cases where it's just a pain in the butt and you can't figure out the right way to do something. And then you spend a long time. And I'm doing that, today on some of this legacy code. But if you're on a greenfield project and you're working in an area you understand, you're not writing code that talks to, microcontrollers and a language you don't understand, weird stuff like that. As long as you're in a domain you understand and you're proficient with TDD and design, it will. I believe it will always make you faster.
Yeah.
So,
I would add to that a very important aspect is to step a little bit outside of the coding part right now. So, what is actually time to market in that case? So, is it the first time this feature hits the market, or is it when it's done in the market, accepted by everyone, and it's really running? So those are two different things. You can, especially when you go to continuous delivery, it might make sense, or you might have a feature already on the market without exposing it. For example, with feature flags, it's kind of this feature isn't really ready. So just to define that, when it comes to totally done, it's done, it's accepted, it's used by nearly everyone. And in this case, in my opinion, TDD, as Jonathan said, in an environment which was created by you. So you are in total control of this environment, and it's less likely that you're actually stuck on something you just created yourself. Can happen, but it shouldn't be. And then, in my opinion, TDD does save you time, because when you don't have that, you need to count every problems which are caused by not testing the code. You need to count them into the time to market aspect as well, because you can't just say, okay, I need to get as fast as possible to the market with my piece of code. So this is not the goal of software development in business. So
I think it's worse than that. If you don't do TDD, you're still testing your code, at least in some sense. I mean, maybe you're hitting a refresh in the browser 1,000 times, or typing make run or something like that 1,000 times, whatever your project does. But you're still testing it in some way. It's just now you're doing it manually in a slower, more cumbersome way. Or at least I hope you're testing it. I mean, maybe you're pushing to production without even running your code at all. I hope not.
We shouldn't assume that everybody is extremely professional and responsible. Like there will be people who think it will be a benevolent benefit for somebody to just push it out untested. Maybe because we're focusing on time to market. Maybe because there's some irrational fear that
let's just hack the PHP file on the server.
Exactly. Maybe there's some irrationality going on there, and they firmly believe that in their context, writing tests would be harmful. People like that exist. Teams like that exist. We shouldn't deny that their existence.
Yeah. For example, WordPress. When the WordPress people, you can define your code in a UI in the backend, in the dashboard of the admin.
Yeah.
So this is one of the worst examples.
It's worth mentioning that WordPress, with any kind of product that is number one in some market, it has so many users that the users
let's stay on software development.
No, but it is software development, because the point is that, for example, Kent Beck talks a lot about this where Facebook is notorious for not writing automated tests, or at least they don't have a culture of it, because they are a number one product in an extremely large market, and for them, testing and production gives them much better results. They can do canary deployments that, outside of static analysis and just making sure that it doesn't cause harm, that it actually integrates correctly. Testing on the actual, just doing monitoring on a live server gives them much better data, much faster, because they have a product that is on an extremely large market, where even if they serve something to 0.01% of their population, of their user base, they will still get around the clock 24/7 telemetry and data constantly, so that they can immediately act on any kind of, there is nothing worse than working in a SaaS company that on a product that is used in the same time zone as you are, and you deploy something on Friday, and nobody will be using it until Tuesday morning, because you will get zero feedback from the users, because the cadence of usage is just too small. But if you're a number one business like Facebook, like Meta, like WordPress, for example, if you make a mistake, you get feedback much faster than if you had written a test. Now, that might still be irresponsible if you're shipping garbage, if your code is really subpar. But it is an argument against test writing that is not irrational. I mean, it's worth taking into consideration.
It's not entirely rational. However, I trust Kent Beck's judgment a lot more than I trust my own experience in this regard, because I worked at a company that did the same thing. I worked at Booking.com.
Yeah,
and they had a very strong culture against testing. They would ridicule people for testing. It was a very unhealthy, toxic culture in that regard.
Yeah.
But they also, and that their whole spiel was, wouldn't you rather have good monitoring than good testing? And but they would have. I only worked there for a year, and in that year there were at least 2 weeks where they could not deploy anything because things were broken.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's.
So
I don't think it's quite as cut and dried as.
It's not. I would still encourage people to test. I would still encourage people to write tests, because yes, you handle this idea of, okay, there's no regressions, it sort of kind of works. But the other thing that TDD really allows you to manage is your anxiety, is this idea of, if I present it in front of a living customer, is this the first time it has reached a human? With an automated test suite, you can at least say, well, we have given this car the best means of proof to us that it won't explode the moment a human sits in it, right? So it's this sort of perhaps second degree fantasy of, I gave it my best effort, and then a user tests it, and then there's nothing, let's say, extremely wrong with it. But hold on, before we get sidetracked, there's a part of the question that I also wanted to address. Can we just go back
Yes.
to which one was it?
We have all stat. So Jeff just had the last stat question.
So the question was pertaining time to market, right? And I love Jonathan that you mentioned. I'm just gonna drop it real quick so I can see Jonathan's face. And drop the banner as well. Jonathan, you mentioned that if you're learning TDD, if you're, let's say, less experienced in it, that it will definitely negatively impact time to market.
Oh yeah.
And we had a very similar conversation recently regarding trunk-based development, because the Dora DevOps report from 2023 stated that trunk-based development and continuous integration to some level causes more burnout in a team.
I remember reading that. Yeah.
But it was inconclusive, and it was hitting all the red buttons on LinkedIn, and it was all the rage after the whole McKinsey debacle for a good chunk of November. And recently, we since then I started frequenting the Google groups of the Dora of the what is it? It's a group, right? It's a group. The Dora group has weekly meetings, and I attended those, and a lot of enthusiasts from our book club also attend those. And they addressed this, and they gave us the missing detail that the data was not presenting in the report, and that was that on average it leads to a little bit more burnout. Why? Because the less experienced people in the survey, the juniors, the people who are not experienced with trunk-based development, they were much more burnt out due to the added friction of maintaining this discipline, because it is quite a very strong discipline. Whereas the more mature, whereas the more experienced trunk-based developers, they had no problems. For them, they went through the learning curve, the hurdle, and for them, it was actually a net benefit. It lowered their anxiety. It improved their well-being. But for a person who is not very good at it, right? So it's this idea of we will drive a tractor, and everybody who doesn't know how to drive a tractor will hate their life. But then once you learn it, it becomes this whole amazing.
I don't understand that really, because when I take a look at our juniors, it is way more complicated to tell someone to work in a Git flow environment than in trunk-based. In trunk-based, you just pull and push. This is what you do. And then you have some PIs, and that's it. And you try to solve them as fast as possible. You talk more with your colleagues, which should reduce burnout, because you don't have this. You have this 2 weeks old branch which is not working, and then you sit there alone as a junior trying to merge that stuff. Exactly. That's burnout. That's even burnout for me. I hate merging. Merging is no.
I wonder if this is people who've learned the bad habits and then join a team when it's doing CI/CD, and they have to unlearn everything, because whether it's easier or not, unlearning habits is stressful.
It is stressful. Yes.
Yeah. And I can say this from experience, working with a lot of people who are accustomed to Git flow or to 6-week branches and all this stuff, and trying to convince them and teach them how to take that 6,000 line pull request and let's turn it into a bunch of small pull requests. Do one a day. Just teaching them how to think that way is stressful. It's stressful for me teaching them. I'm not even the one doing the work.
Yeah, same here. So Anjana just mentioned, like, TDD handles anxiety for me. My code could be modified by another team member sometime later for a different reason. Then either the test needs an update or the new code broke my behavior. Right? So you sort of have this idea that I don't have to be in the room when code that I just wrote is being further improved or changed. And it sort of alleviates this anxiety of, I just created this, and tomorrow when you take over, you don't need to wait for me. I don't need to report to you. I don't need to sort of hand off something weird, because it's already in the code base. Everything you need to know is already in the code base, in its let's say purest minimal form. And we did cover this as well in the newsletter article, because this was the idea of so what did the correspondents report? So I went to this distinction of separating out test first, test during, and then test after by you, test after by someone else, and test later, which is usually never, right? And And there were already differences in test during and test first, which was very surprising to me. I only expected there to be a huge gap between test after and test first, but there was actually the further down the timeline you went, the more extreme these benefits started to become. And I think one of the clear sort of feedback loops that are happening here is that if your code is not testable, I'm sort of reading down the red dots here, right? So if you don't have tests, your feedback will be late, which means you're speculating a lot, and that speculation will cause pressures on the critical points in your timeline, which means that, I don't know that it works, I just assume it does, and then we're sort of cramming together this sort of critical mass check, this test, human test, manual test, somewhere along the timeline towards the deadline, which is usually a day before the deadline. And then if something goes wrong, we need to do last minute testing to figure out what's wrong and how to fix it, and whether once we fix it, it actually works. And then that kind of decision making requires a degree of pragmatism and triage that says we don't have time to make this. I wish it wasn't like this. We don't have time to fix it now. We just need to make the most pragmatic change to stay on the timeline, to keep with some irrational fear of being late to the market. And then those kinds of heroics and hacks cause design issues, and those design issues then cause low coverage, and then it's hard to write tests, and then it starts the next cycle of this. Right. So the best way to deal with this cycle is if you're in a brownfield environment, and this is from the book from Michael Feathers, Working Effectively with Legacy Code, is just find a way to separate out yourself from the framework, from the old code base, from the environment that you're working with, so that if you're working on something new, if you're adding functionality, try to separate it out from the thing you're adding it to, so that you can test it in isolation, so that you can think about it in isolation. The point isn't that you can test it. The point is that you can think about it as a singular concept. You don't have to think about it in the terms of, I'm writing this function, and this function calls this other thing, and then this other thing, and then because that other thing is that this, and then because if it takes for you to explain it to somebody a very long time, and more than 10 lines of prose, 10 lines of, in chat, then you're having this problem that occurs due to bad design. And you never pushed through the effort of improving design because you have no tests to signal that your design decisions are bad. Right. So usually I often say to people, use TDD as a KPI. Use it to see what's wrong with your pipeline.
Okay, so we have halftime.
Halftime. Oh, that went fast.
So we still have some questions, so we need to reduce a little bit the presentation things.
Yeah.
I've just posted in the chat, in the comment, a link to a survey I made today. Maybe if some of you haven't voted yet, would be interesting to know how many of you actually use TDD. So we will display that poll in half an hour or something like that. Okay. So we have, I would say, one or two more questions, and we definitely need to go to the next aspect, then especially the implementation part. So we have Alex Jukes. In my experience, the best way to teach TDD is pairing. But as largely the only practitioner of TDD in my engineering organization, but with significant influence as the head of engineering, pairing with everyone simply isn't practical or possible. Any other recommendations for how to help people grok this process, Jonathan? There was a comment, Jonathan, inside there.
Yeah. I agree that pairing is a great way to go. I didn't learn it that way. I learned it through trial and error, and it took me a long time. I was one of those people who hated TDD. The first time I learned about TDD, I was at a conference. Someone demonstrated it on screen. I thought, that's cool. They were trying to show off a framework for Postgres, actually, to do TDD in your database. And I thought, that's cool. I'll go try it. And I went home and tried it. And I thought, this is stupid. This is slowing me down. It's annoying. I hate this. I'm never going to do this again. And for years, I was one of those people on the other side of the fence who was telling everybody how terrible TDD is. And then I read Michael Feathers' book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code. And so I started working on writing tests to make refactoring safe. I didn't care about TDD. I just wanted my refactors to work and to stop having regressions in production. Eventually, I came to the point where I would see the test I was going to write afterwards, and I thought, if I would write that test first, testing would be faster, because I would have immediate feedback as soon as I hit save or whatever that I've reached my goal. That's how I got to TDD. So it was a long journey of trial and error and reading books. I think the most important thing for people, if you can pair people with a junior, someone fresh out of boot camp or something, if you can pair with them and just teach them the best practices from the beginning, that's probably the best for them. I've spoken to a few people who've learned that way. That's wonderful. Most people will never be in that situation, at least not for decades, until the majority of us are TDD practitioners and have mentors available. I think what's much more important for everybody else is to have the motivation to learn TDD. If you have the motivation, if your mentees have the motivation, they'll be easier to mentor. So I would focus on what problems does it solve. When you see them making mistakes or see them struggling with something, talk about the techniques, TDD being one of them, that might help solve some of those problems or relieve some of that anxiety. So I would focus on the motivation more than the technical how-to.
Yeah.
I mean, it takes a page to write down how to do TDD. Red-green refactor is pretty simple to explain the mechanics of it. The hard part is the motivation. If people are motivated, they will look for answers on how to do the red-green refactor, how to do the 4 steps, whichever model they're using. They'll look for how to do that. So that would be my answer. Focus on the motivation. If people are pushing back, understand why. They probably have legitimate reasons to push back.
Yes.
It's not that they're stupid. It's that their experience doesn't match with yours, and that's fine. We all have a unique experience.
We need to clip that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a good. And now you are in a flow, so we have the next question of Alex. Any thoughts on how TDD fit into programming that doesn't have consistent outputs? The example very prominent at the moment is AI prompt engineering.
I would say all these kinds of contexts have consistent outputs, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to define it. And this is where I would come back to this idea of, for this kind of scenario specifically, create a testing plan. Like, what do you even expect to see? Right. So what do you expect to see written down in the testing list? Because you have to capture it in the context of, well, I have to describe it to somebody. Like, I have to describe the business case to somebody, right? So when I ask the AI to tell me to list 10 restaurants in Ljubljana, then I would expect that if I write a test that sort of tests whether I got 10 things back and are they restaurants, that conversation is meaningful. And even if the output is chaotic, I would at least to some degree want to be able to control the chaos. What are the for AI specifically, that might just be the fitness function, right? So you might not even need TDD for that. Maybe the fitness of what kind of answers the model gives you, maybe those are your tests. But maybe you're not writing them in such a manner that you would define it and then you would go and pursue it, because it's a much larger beast, and you're sort of tied to the implementation of the LLM. If you're talking about LLM, but if you're talking about random outputs, you can also say, well, if the output is random, I expect if I ask it 1,000,000 times, 50% to be heads and 50% to be tails. Like, at least I would like to know what the odds and the distribution of that are. So this isn't a problem of consistent outputs. This is a problem of, does the engineer writing the tests understand statistics enough to the degree that they can express something that is actually meaningful, right? So, for example, how do you test a roulette table? This is a solved problem, but it requires business understanding to be able to express the test in such a way that isn't nonsense to the thing that is being developed.
I think it's 2 steps, and you hit both of them. But just to make it clear, the first is, how do you know if the thing succeeds or not? As a human, if you were doing it manually, how would you know if it was successful? And then, how can you put that into code? And both of those can be hard problems to solve. Don't be fooled. It's not that these are easy, but that's the way to think about it.
So usually the problems are of the nature of, is this a hat? The human says, yes, it's a hat. So when the human says it's a hat, the computer should always say it's hat. Now, sometimes engineers don't know how to capture that aspect of the human deciding that it is actually a hat. Right? So usually these kind of tests have two elements. There's a human element where you say, no, it's nonsense to test it because what you gave me is not a hat. Because it's a ship. It's not even the same ballpark. But you gotta be very precise with what it is you're testing.
Yeah. So let's say in an automated way, let's say you get an answer, you don't know what the answer is, then you can only test that you got an answer.
Yeah.
You could test something like, is the answer a question or is it a statement? Something you know,
confidence level of the answer.
But
the
not
precision of it.
not the
This
content
is
itself.
where techniques like property-based testing can come in handy. You're not testing the literal answer, but just like, is it the right shape? Is it less than a paragraph? Is it blue? Is the image generated basically blue? Is the top half blue? Maybe that's the sky. These sorts of things.
So your eye tests are done like that often as well.
Yep.
It should be a bluish color. It should be a reddish color or something like that. Okay, so we have no question. So we managed to have no stat comments anymore. I think.
Really? We went through all of them?
Do we? No, there's still one.
There's still one.
Oh, but I don't know who that is.
I think this is Thomas. From the grammar and the syntax, I think this is Thomas, one of our regulars. What do you think about monitoring in combination with TDD? Is monitoring more valuable than TDD, or is it a good combination? Or leave TDD and only do monitoring? I would say this is an orthogonal problem. You want both.
They solve different problems.
So even if you're not doing both, I would say ensure that your engineers, if you really care about their well-being and sort of professionalism and their craft, ensure that they know how to do both, and then let them decide to what degree, to what ratio, or to sort of what extent they want to do each. But I would say it would be meaningful to expose everybody in your company to good monitoring practices, the same way as it is meaningful to expose everybody in your company to good 3D practices. Even if they don't want to, like, train them and then let them decide. Because they're smart professionals. They will have a very good reason why not to do monitoring, just like they can have a very good reason why not to do TDD. Now, that might not always be a rational decision. It might have to do with some kind of speculation. It might have to do some with fear or some gut feeling of, intuitively, I think here it's harmful. Jonathan, you mentioned booking. I heard a lot of stories about Meta as well. I've been in companies before, more agency-style companies, where they said the client, it's a bit of a shady business model already to begin with, so the client won't pay us to do testing. That's sort of that most pragmatic, the most extreme side of the business pragmatism around testing. It's like, oh, we can afford to ship junk because the client only pays us for one iteration. And to add a little bit of a context to Alex's question, because we skipped over it and I wanted to respond. Alex, since you're head of engineering, how to introduce TDD into an org. I did speak to Alex a while ago privately, and I would say check if there's anything in your organization, in your organizational culture, stigmatizing or preventing test writing. That is what I would, as a coach, that is one of the first things that I would check. Is there any kind of stigma or like weird behavioral stuff going on around this idea of test writing? Is there some competition going on who pushes out things faster and the person writing tests is slower? Like, is there any kind of heroics going on, like Phoenix Project level heroics? Check that. And if it does exist, try to figure out what incentivizes that behavior, and then disincentivize, like remove those incentives, and it's not enough, punish that behavior. And then introduce the, counterbalance it. Because it's possible that it's just dysfunctional from something that used to work, but it's no longer benevolent. It's no longer harmless to continue that kind of behavior. Due to scale, due to fragmentation. Maybe all of the engineers who originally built a legacy system understood perfectly what it does. They didn't write tests, and then they left the company. And now nobody knows what the system does, and now they should be, almost mandated to be writing tests in a TDD fashion, because now the amount of authorship on the code base is 5%, not 99%. right? So if the context changes, you need to be aware of it and sort of do, code-based forensics. Are the authors still with the company? If not, try to figure out if test writing is stigmatized or in some way there's some heroics going on, remove incentives, and try to get them on a different path.
Good. So, we had 2 major points on the agenda, and actually, links between well-being.
Refresh the document because I just changed it before it went live.
Yeah, we have 3 now.
Yeah.
So, adoption from scratch, impact on engineering culture, and links between well-being.
Yeah, I think
That's
we
very
touched
agile.
on- yeah, I think we captured greenfield versus brownfield. What about well-being and productivity?
We
Jonathan?
had that already with this burnout stuff, but
with
we
this
could
burnout stuff. Yeah.
yeah, but we could have some sentences on that in particular of well-being, because well-being is not about having burnout or not. It's about a little bit more than that. So, Jonathan, what would be your take? Is TDD improving well-being or not in general?
In general, I would say probably yes on most projects. I mean, I can sleep better. I can deploy with greater confidence. All these sorts of things on a project where TDD is practiced. There are some assumptions built in there. Like the project, is prepared for TDD. Certain legacy projects aren't, and you can't just take your TDD hammer to an old legacy code base and expect it to work. So that sort of thing aside, assuming greenfield or a project that has been refactored to allow TDD, yeah, I think it should improve well-being. You get faster feedback. Back to the point about monitoring versus TDD. I mean, even if we, let's assume that Kent Beck is absolutely right and the monitoring at Facebook is spectacular and it completely makes TDD irrelevant. I would still like the faster feedback from TDD versus waiting for a deployment to happen and to start getting, even if the deployment only takes 5 minutes and I'm getting immediate telemetry, I can have TDD results in 10 microseconds. I'd rather have that, at least when it's possible. So, that even in that sort of utopian Facebook ideal world of monitoring, yeah, TDD is going to improve my well-being. It's going to make me more productive and faster and give me confidence to move quicker.
Let's look at that from the opposite lens. Is TDD ever harmful to well-being?
I think there's a lot of rhetoric and attitudes around TDD that are harmful. If somebody's trying to force you to do TDD against your will, or telling you that you're stupid because you can't do it right, or that sort of stuff. There's a lot of toxicity around it.
But is that actually harmful? Because I was recently watching Diary of a CEO. You might know it. It's quite a popular podcast. I think it's one of the top podcasts right now. And they had a Harvard professor on who deals with nutrition, well-being, and fitness, and just physical fitness, workout, right? And they had a really interesting take that I think is very similar to mandating TDD practices. Because I was in a situation once where I mandated TDD adoption and had interesting responses, right? So this Harvard professor, his name escapes me. I'm very sorry, but it's one of the recent episodes, and he basically presented the case study of I believe, Swedish company, where they said everybody from now on is mandated to go to the gym with their coworkers on Fridays. Like, it's on the calendar. Because they said, okay, well, your physical health is, and move, and just any kind of physical activity will be a net benefit to your health. So we're mandating it. Like, what we're mandated to worry about your sleep by law. Now we're also mandating about your workout and nutrition. And it has an interesting take. Like, a lot of people quit that company, right? So everybody who was like, no, that's too private. Like, that's inappropriate for you to be sort of mandating that, that I work out. Even if it's to the benefit of my health, it is still in some irrational, romanticized way, let's say, inappropriate. It breaches some very core boundaries. Because if you look at it, we mandate physical activity in schools. We mandate physical activity in kindergarten. Why don't we mandate physical activity it at work, especially with
I think
software
it could be
engineers.
appropriate to mandate TDD in a training environment, but I would never mandate it in a professional environment.
No, but I'm getting to that. Like, so the
Okay.
point is,
All right.
if I were to remove 3D from the conversation and just make it about a workout, if I mandate workout, some people would quit,
I would.
even if it's to their benefit, right? So that's my
Well,
point.
or,
Like,
or- but
this,
maybe.
so this kind of behavior is considered rational. Like,
By whom?
it is in it no. So
But
so to oppose it and say no, that's too far, I quit. That is a completely rational decision.
okay.
It
Got it.
reaches some like inappropriate boundary.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems that talking about TDD, about whether to mandate it or not, is touching on exactly the same nerve. Is that there is something very, let's say, private going on in how I think and how I write code and how I am, let's say, mandated to think or speak, that a lot of non-practitioners would object to if it was forced upon them. Even if it's, let's say, to the net benefit of the team or the
So
organization,
let's take
etc.
scenario a little bit. Let's say rather than saying that you're mandated to go to the gym with your colleagues on Fridays,
Mhm.
let's say the mandate is on an outcome basis instead, and it says you are mandated to pass a physical examination every 3 months.
Oh, I like that. I like that.
And we will pay you to go to the gym if you want to, but if you can achieve the same outcomes in some other way, that's also fine.
Mm.
Mhm.
You know, then you have the same "it's good for you" outcome,
Jonathan
but we're
raising
not
stakes.
approaching on your personal life and how you do things.
Mhm.
That's how I approach TDD. I will mandate that we need good test coverage and I don't use percentages, but I mean like
Yeah.
good tests. If and more important, when something breaks, you're responsible for fixing your own bugs, and you're the one who gets the and you're on the rotation for getting woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning when the server goes down and this sort of stuff.
Mhm.
So I put my developers on they're on the horn. They're the ones responsible for the quality of their code.
Mhm.
If they can achieve that quality with or without TDD, I don't care.
Okay.
Now, I happen to believe that TDD is the best way to achieve that quality in most cases, or in many cases.
It certainly
But if
requires the
somebody can
least
prove me
discipline.
wrong and get those same results some other
Yeah.
way, that's on them. That's fine.
And I agree with that take. But you said physical exam, some kind of physical examination every 3 months. Now, in the world of fitness, let's say, because it is so prevalent since the Industrial Revolution and the army, especially, we have physical examinations in school because of military efforts to sort of standardize physical fitness and well-being. And same with the IQ tests. It was also from the Scrum is also a military invention, by extension. The physical fitness test is standardized because the humans are, let's say, of about the same topology for the most part. Is such a physical, let's say, a fitness test available, and like it's such a exam available for TDD for a product
for
engineering
TDD.
effort? Not for TDD, just the outcomes that TDD produces. So
Well, I
easy
think
to
that's
test
kind of what the
code,
DORA report's
well-designed
about.
code.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it like gives you a pass or fail grade, but and I don't know that I care about that. But what I care about is that the developers are responsible for their own stuff.
Mhm.
And that I believe instills the responsibility and the caring to do things in a I don't want to say the right way, but a right way.
A right way, yeah.
If I'm responsible to fix the server when it breaks because I didn't test my code before I push it to production,
Mhm.
I'm going to learn to write better code in the future, whether it's TDD or otherwise. The analogy I like to use is for developers being responsible for their own messes.
Yeah.
When I cook dinner, and my wife's busy or whatever, she usually cooks, but sometimes I cook. And if I leave a mess lying around, my wife has one of two choices. She can either say, "Jonathan, come in here and clean up the mess," or she can say, "Jonathan, you made a mess, but I cleaned it up."
Mhm.
Which of those is more likely to change my behavior in the future? If she just cleans it up for me, that teaches me that, okay, I can make messes all I want, and it's okay, and my wife takes care of it. The same thing happens when your devs push buggy code and the ops people or the QA people or someone else, whoever it is, the offshore team, does the bug fixes, or does the triage, or does the emergency response.
Yeah.
Get those developers doing that stuff, and they learn to clean up their own messes. So I don't know what I don't know what the litmus test is for is my kitchen clean after I do dinner, but just make me clean up my own mess, and I'll eventually have a cleaner kitchen after every time.
But I would really have a question here. So how do you manage it that your wife is not yelling at you in that moment?
Well, she yells. Don't worry.
Okay, that's interesting.
So, but I have a similar take.
It helps that I just finished making dinner, so she's already on my good side.
But because Jeff mentioned this in the comment as well, for the physical examination thing, one would have to demonstrate that it's relevant to the work being done. I see this take a lot with testing, where engineers will just tell me, my client doesn't care if it's tested or not. And usually my response to that is yes, but if there was something wrong, they would care that you fix it as soon as possible. Right. So, but the idea behind it is quite useful for the analogy you just made with the kitchen. Right. So if you say, okay, you made a mess, she has the option now to clean up after you. Let's move this one step further. You're not at home. You're in some kind of, let's say, bed and breakfast, and the bed and breakfast needs to be clean for the next guest. Now, should we instill a culture of discipline to the guests that they need to be cleaning up after themselves, or will we just assume that they always leave a mess? So we will have a really rigorous crisis team ready to clean up the mess immediately because we just assume there will be a mess. I can tell you
how I do that as the owner of a bed and breakfast rental.
Okay. I forgot.
We assume that they're going to leave a mess, and we have a cleaner come to do it. But there is a cleaning fee that's part of the rental, so that's kind of covered. But there is a threshold if they do too much, if they leave a permanent stain or they break something, we charge them extra. We had a guest break the TV. We had to buy a €300 TV to replace it, and so we sent them a bill.
Did they pay it?
They paid part of it. They disputed it, but they didn't really dispute it. So I think they know that they were guilty. But yeah, different story.
Different story. But my point is, engineers, teams, product teams, entire departments will often take that stance. It's like, no, the problem wasn't the requirements.
If you want to take that stance, I think it's rational. I don't think it's a good idea, but it's rational in the sense of contract negotiation. But if you're doing that, you just be honest with yourself and admit you are not in the realm of agile software development. You are intentionally avoiding agile, because agile is about collaboration with the customer, not contracts. It's right there in the manifesto. So if that's the approach you're taking, just be honest that you're not trying to be agile, and if that works for you, okay, fine. I mean, I can't imagine there's not a better way, but okay, that's your choice. Admit that you're being draconian, Tayloristic, and you're doing it the quote wrong way, and just live with it. Take pros and cons, take it all, but do it open-mindedly. Do it willingly. That's what you're doing. That you're not trying to learn from best practices. That you're doing it your way.
And I think that's one of the doing it your way is, I think, one of the core problems here that we're sort of trying to address, because this is a discipline. This is a discipline for, let's say, the levels of professionals and craftspeople who take their discipline seriously, right? So part of, and partially, their agility seriously, right? So part of quality is defining what quality should be, right? So there needs to be a bar, like how secure do we want it to be? How performant do we want it to be? How scalable do we want it to be? How are we architecting this? What doors are we opening? What doors are we closing? What decisions are we making? What decisions are we not making? What are we test covering? What are we not test covering? Usually, this idea of, oh, the client doesn't care if it's tested, which is the comment from Jeff right now, then let's delete all the code and functionality that we don't care about. I think this comes from a accidental Taylorian approach to this factory or sort of manufacturer-esque factory line way of building code of, if it wasn't defined that it's necessary, we're just not going to add it. To their own detriment, because it might be expected to be there, but because it wasn't defined, they assumed that it's safe to leave out.
I think it's even more insidious than that, honestly. I don't think it's just that people assume that because it wasn't specified as safe to leave out. I think they're just making a logical fallacy that anyone who says the customer doesn't care if it's tested hasn't even thought for 5 seconds about what they're saying.
Exactly.
The customer wants something that works. If they wanted something broken, they would have just gone to the to the thrift store with a hammer and bought something for $5 and broken it. If that's what they wanted, they literally want something that works. That's why they're freaking paying you.
Yeah.
Now, do they care if it's tested? Well, not in the. They don't care if it's tested in the same way you don't care if the plumber who installed your toilet made sure it doesn't leak when it flushes. Do you care if the plumber flushes your toilet? Well, maybe not, but you do certainly care if the toilet leaks.
Yeah.
And if the way to ensure that it doesn't leak is to test flush it, then yes, of course you want your plumber to test flush the toilet. So, whoever makes this claim that the customer doesn't want tests or doesn't care about tests, they're just not thinking through what they're saying, I believe. If somebody can prove me wrong, I'm willing to be convinced otherwise. If there's some legitimate case for this,
customers always implicitly assume any kind of software to be high quality. I've never seen somebody say, "Oh, because it's free, I expect it to break and not work sometimes."
Yeah.
Never.
So even free software is expected to work perfectly. Yeah. So it's not dedicated to price or something. This is just we as humans assuming that the things we buy work. So and every time something is not working and it's working, let's say not a second time, next time, then we will probably buy something different. And this is how we think. We're not thinking like, oh, maybe we can help them improving their stuff by talking about how they're doing their tests. This is not so. This is then not the idea of the customer. The customer just wants to have it done properly. That's all. And the customer is expecting that you do all the necessary steps to ensure that. So we had the plumber example as well with basically with trunk-based development aspect, where you expect that the plumber is able to do that in the session, and not another plumber is coming 2 days later and reviewing the work. So it's basically the same like that. You have specific expectations as a human being of services delivered to you. And this is the same with delivered, if you order something at Amazon and it's coming to you, you have the expectation that it's all fine. Otherwise, you send it back. But you don't really think about what was the reason that it's actually broken. You just expect that it's working. This is the reason why Amazon is trying to make you not thinking about that too much. But tests are, for you as a developer or an engineer, are necessary, in my opinion, to make sure that this expectation is met. So it cannot really be, it's of course you could run tests without it, but you need to make sure the contract is fulfilled. So this is, I think, the key aspect of it. So and maybe additionally to that, we as engineers often think too technical. So we often forget this. We are just part of a business which is running. Most of the time it's about business. So there are expectations, there is some form of contract or contracts running and requirements, and we are just a part of that cycle to fulfill those contracts and create or implement those requirements and keep the qualities. And another thing is that people don't understand the word quality. So, but I don't want to make this a topic now. And this is what we as engineers need to basically should learn early on, that we are not there for coding. We are there for creating output, which is usable by someone else, which is the reason why being just a developer and not knowing about what happens with your code when the user is basically using it, so not receiving feedback, is one of the biggest mistakes we can do or practice. And this is what, in basically the core aspect of the question, is because tech people often disconnect themselves from the users. And this is that should be changed. So in 10 or 20 years, we don't code anymore. So we don't do that hands-on stuff anymore because AI is doing that then in some form of no-code stuff. And we should take care of that now to understand that we are software developers, software engineers, and not per se just coders. So just my 5 cents to that.
And I would mention sort of the human nature aspect of it. That you need to be very careful with your incentives, right? So, for example, it's very easy for me to eat in an unhealthy way, If you buy me a cake and you buy me an apple, I will intrinsically want to eat the cake. Even if I'm intellectually telling myself that that's not a good thing, I will intrinsically sort of gravitate towards the cake because it looks delicious and fluffy and sweet.
Yes,
Right? There's something irrational about that. Right? So as long as you have both of these things in front of you, it's like I can write a test or I cannot write a test. If there are incentives in place to sort of force this decision constantly onto the developer, which decision are they taking? Of course, the easier one. The easier one in their current context. If their context is low well-being, stress, anxiety, which path do they take? The one that doesn't produce tests, because it's easier. It makes their pain lesser, or at least it makes their pain worse to a lesser degree now compared to the other alternative, even though it has long-term benefits. But that is a very hard decision to be constantly making, especially with less experienced engineers. Right? So sadly, if you're a leader, if you're a tech lead or a CTO, a head of engineering, as we had Alex earlier on asking a question, the problem of improving the capital efficiency of your testing is not something you can delegate. Nobody else in the company can solve this problem. Product cannot solve this problem. The CEO can't solve this problem. Your customers cannot solve this problem. Your QA cannot solve this problem, especially if your QA is inspection focused. If it's just saying, oh no, too bad, right? So if it's just doing inspection, capital efficiency of testing. So capital efficiency in the sense that if I invest money into it, how hard is it to write tests? Like how annoying is it to write tests? Jonathan, you mentioned earlier, if the project is just not ready for tests, if it's not ready for TDD, that is a problem. That is a encoding environment, a code base that is not capital efficient in regard to testing. That is a problem in itself that cannot be delegated. And if you don't deal with it, it will always become worse. Now, some people call this technical debt. I think that is a too broad and too vague description of the problem. The real issue is that engineers experience a constant frustration with how difficult it is to write tests. I would always elevate that problem as something extremely important to be addressed regularly every day, bit by bit if necessary, because it will never go away. And you cannot delegate it. You cannot hire a consultant to solve it for you. They will solve it for you. But as long as your engineers outproduce the capital inefficient code compared to the fixes you're doing, you are never outrunning this problem. It will always sort of bury you back in the same level of quicksand, essentially. Like you need to go to the root cause of the problem, which is your engineers need to be incentivized to think about the capital efficiency of their work, the capital efficiency of their output, the testing regimen, the way to design code. How hard is it to change something? How often do you change something? Is it when you change something, is the person doing the change the same as the author of the original code? How often does that happen? Are you even aware of how to make that decision? These are all very good measures, and Grant mentions it. Hello, Grant. This is shift left behavior, right? This is shift left good behavior. Like you need to bring the problem of, oh, we have a defect in production and the QA person caught it. You need to bring this back to the engineer as soon as possible. The point isn't, the point with QA, I hate that I have to keep mentioning this, but the point of QA is not to run the tests. The point of QA is to make the engineers better testers. Right? So you're increasing the capital efficiency of quality being added to the software before it ships. That's what QA is for. QA is not there to sort of tell you, oh, the good enough, not good enough. It's not a judge. It's not what it's there for.
Yeah, because there are many attempts that basically transition the QA to more form of a consultant than actually let's say a controlling mechanism. Then you basically have a testing mechanism. So in many companies you say, or I read about those actually, that the QA are consultants for the developers. So they are often part of the DevOps team. So while they are developing, they are basically in pairing sessions. This is just, let's say, experienced engineers instead of some artificial testers who try to figure out if requirements were met. It is more like the requirements should be understood before you actually start to code. And this is the reason why it's important that you as a developer get feedback and not the QA person. You as a developer should receive that feedback. And then you can basically work that into your code, into your, let's say, into your test. We're talking about TDD. So you can already update your test or create your test like the requirements. And that in that moment, the QA person, a more experienced person in that case than you are, who is aware of that, let's say, aware of the requirements, aware of the qualities, aware of the client itself, then you have, 4 eyes on that problem. And then you push, and then you're done actually waiting for the next feedback to come, but not for some, that it's a staging system. 1 week later, you get that several pushes, many changes, and you get a report, and no one is knowing, okay, what caused the problems, and you don't know where to start. This is nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. And it never really works. It disconnects everything, and it's so much mental overhead to actually work in such an environment. And still, the majority of environments I know and face are like that, and that's the sad part of it. And we should change it. Yeah, sorry.
I think you mentioned a scenario that I want to push back on a little bit, and I don't know if you were advocating it or just pointing out that this is the reality often of having a QA person or team or whatever that presumably understands customer requirements better or something. If that's your situation, I would encourage you to fix your situation. That's broken. I mean, if your developers do not understand customer requirements, then they don't have any business writing code for customers. And when you add a QA person to that scenario, you just have one extra opinion about what the customer wants. If you're building software customers don't need, there's 2 solutions. One is faster feedback, work into smaller iterations, push the trunk more frequently and get feedback faster from customers. That's one. The other is to talk to your customers, find out what they need. Maybe they're internal customers, maybe they're physical, actual, external customers. But talk to those people. If your developers are too busy to come to an understanding of what customers need, they're too busy to be developers, because that's the job. That is the job. The job is to build solutions for customers.
That's
the end of the story.
Pro tip: ask. How can I actually get feedback of my clients? Ask them.
Yeah. Now, to be fair, that's very tricky in some companies. Some companies put 15 layers of bureaucracy between you and your customer.
But we're always talking about engineering culture problems, and engineering culture goes up to the CEO in most companies.
Well, the issue is that it's not. The issue isn't that developers are talking to customers or not talking to customers. The problem is when you get information from a customer, whether you have spoken to them yourself or not, do you act upon it? Like, is it a priority for you to act upon the feedback that you have received? Like, that's the point. Because if you're not a product team, if you're just a project team or a task force, then once you're done and it goes to the customer, you are tasked with another project.
Yeah.
Right. So you are no longer in the business of responding to this customer's feedback because you're serving some other customer right now.
Well,
right? So,
or not serving another customer.
Or not serving another customer because you're late, because you have to stop working with them. And
or you're just doing whatever your PO told you to do because you don't know what the customer actually wants.
Exactly. Right. So the point here isn't so much whether you are talking to the customer or not. The point is whether information from the customer concentrates decision-making power or dilutes it. Right. So a lot of people are working in cost centers. The engineering teams or the engineering department is a cost center. Any kind of feedback from the customer dilutes decision-making power, right? Because they say, we have 10 things on the roadmap, customer said something, damn it, now we have 11 things on the roadmap, right? So that is a process of dilution. Customer feedback is preferred if it doesn't exist because it will make our lives easier.
Right.
A product team, on the other hand, that is a profit center, customer feedback is a vessel of concentration. We want to do 10 things. Oh, we got feedback from the customer. Well, we do that first. And then we decide on the 10 things. Mm-hmm. Right? So it's a completely different mentality. Is it about dilution or is it about concentration? If it's about dilution and you just say, oh, developers, hey, sorry, but your quality is poo-poo, go talk to the customer. Well, what happens? Information comes in, it just dilutes the roadmap even more. And it just makes them more anxious.
But I think the kind of the point I want to make is I think there's commonly at least 4 actors in this scenario. There's the customer, there's the developer, and then usually between there you have a product manager or owner or something like that, and a QA person. Fair. And a typical flow is the product owner, manager, whatever, ostensibly talks to the customer, or they look at reports about customer surveys and decide what the customer wants based on that, whatever, and they make up a list of requirements and they pass that on to the developer who does something, and then it goes to QA who then looks at the same requirements and reinterprets them through their own lens, and decides whether or not the developer has done the right thing or not. And this is the core problem I want to point out, that the developer and the QA or the tester, whatever you want to call this person in this scenario, they have two unverified opinions about what the customer wants.
Yeah.
Probably based on a third unverified opinion of what the customer wants.
Yeah.
So, this isn't actually improving quality. What it is doing is slowing down feedback, which in turn hurts quality. So in most organizations, adding QA hurts quality rather than helping quality.
We have a quality problem at the moment.
I have a quality problem. I'm getting feedback, but
Live demonstration. Sorry to have interrupted you, Jim.
This won't make any sense to our listeners, so Spotify users, I'm very sorry, but you're just gonna have to watch the video to figure out what just happened.
I guess my basic point is, if you're using QA as an independent verification of something, you're doing it wrong. You're not improving quality. You're hurting quality. Instead, find different ways to use QA. Have QA do exploratory testing to find new ways to optimize user flows. Don't have them do regression testing at least. I mean, for God's sake, don't have humans doing regression testing. Computers are excellent at that. People are terrible at that. That's the complete opposite way you should do it. Have your human people with brains doing exploratory testing, finding new ways to stress the system, new ways to improve the system, coming up with new user stories. If we tweak these things around, the user flow would be easier, this sort of stuff. Don't have them doing
to be clear, the incentive is not to break the system and cause harm.
Right.
The incentive is to create a new way of improving the system by learning something by breaking it. Yeah. Right. So the outcome is that we're improving the system. The outcome isn't that we want to find many different ways to break it.
Right.
Because I can just pull the plug and I can break the system, but that's not an actionable item point that adds quality to the system.
Yeah.
But hold on. I just want to respond to something you said on your previous point. When you're getting this idea of the product owner or somebody who's in touch with the customer, whether they're doing surveys or not directly, the point is that it's really important that they capture the outcome of the requirements. If they interpret the requirements and trying to translate them into implementation, everybody will put their own twist on it. Yep. And then that is also one of the core things that TDD exposes. You might not be doing TDD, but you might not be doing TDD because of this reason. Because your business requirements talk about implementation efforts, not about business outcomes. If your product requirements don't capture outcomes, then the team doing TDD cannot own the problem. They can only own the task of doing the implementation, at which point they need to now stop developing and apply a huge amount of back pressure back up to the area of the organization where this request came from, go there and yoink responsibility and sort of merge the outcome with the implementation effort. And that is annoying because that to a lot of people seems inappropriate. Like I, as an engineer, should not have to say F you to all of these other people who are mandating like the project plan, and they have went into a considerable amount of stress to create a roadmap. Now I have to go back and tell them, hey guys, you gave me a lot of implementation tasks. I need to understand what the business concerns are, and I need to own them, right? Like that is a problem of agility that has to be solved top down. Now, it doesn't have to come from the top, but it helps if it does. But the core idea here is that if you're writing business requirements, if your business requirements suck, your team won't be able to do TDD. So you gotta solve that problem holistically.
Agreed.
Jeff does have another question. That's also very interesting. Does feedback from the customer just add work to the backlog, or does it help focus work and priorities so that today's work is on the most important and valuable work that creates real value most quickly? What would you say about that?
That was our conversation about dilution and focus, I believe, concentration.
Yeah, it was just 2 minutes ago.
Yeah, Jonathan?
I think it depends on how your team works, how you're focused. Ideally, feedback from a customer doesn't just add to work to the backlog. In fact, ideally, you don't have a backlog. You just respond to your customer. Your customer calls and says, "Hey, we need this thing," and you do that. I'm a big fan of no or very limited backlogs. If you are a backlog-driven culture, though, definitely customer feedback can just add to the backlog. I mean, I've seen customer requests sit in the backlog for years. Depends on your company and on your team, your culture, how you do this. I don't think there's a one size. There's not a single answer. It depends on how you do it. I could talk about the ideal. I could talk about the worst case scenario, and there's 1,000 options in between.
So we could ask you about your opinion about
But Adrian,
Jira, right?
you're in a similar line of work. I mean, you used to be with at least the agency work that we were doing last year. Do you have similar findings regarding how you're dealing with how you used to deal with the implementation focus? Because you were doing that contractually, right? Like you were absorbing a huge engineering responsibility into WebBar.
Yeah, so I think there are several aspects to it. So first of all, when we take a look, or let's say focusing on the backlog aspect, I'm totally agreeing with Jonathan that a backlog is first of all a bad thing. So it is always strange when you have, let's say, a WIP limit of 4 items and you have 200 in the backlog. Then something is wrong,
Yeah.
And if you have 200 more in the review, you have a real problem. And those were the problems we take over. And the idea was to basically, remove items from the backlog into trash and ask. So if you cannot basically work on those items, so why are they actually there? Because there is most often, and this is actually a topic for next week, and I haven't told you about that, but that's a topic for how let's say development or small businesses actually work on those topics. And this is the problem that you often, this entire design process is often design and requirement process is not part of the development cycle. And this is actually the problem here. So when you disconnect the development cycle from the requirement and design cycle, you create this backlog problem, because the design and requirement people, product owners are talking with the clients, having their wish list, their Christmas wish list, writing things down. They don't really know if it is actually working, or, they don't know the order, how to implement this. They just have an artificial vision of what's to come. This is actually the business idea behind that. And this is not what developers know when they receive a ticket. They oftentimes then receive a ticket which does not tell anything about what's going on with the actual idea behind that. So they implement something, let's say, on their own behalf, because they just see some lines in that ticket. And then they implement something and it goes away. And that's the reason why there's so much in the backlog, because there are people just inventing something which is not based on the actual feedback from the client about one specific ticket, but with the overarching idea of the entire app. So, and this is what I see often as well. It's the second aspect, how the company actually communicates with clients. This is one of the biggest issues. They come, instead of talking every day to each other, they just do that once or twice a month.
Yeah.
And when you do that, you get a lot of, a bunch of things you need to do, which ends up in being a stagnating backlog instead of a constant flow of changes. You need to get rid of that. So this is a pure communication problem you have there. And first of all, development is disconnected from that process. So it's basically not part of the cycle. And the part of the cycle is above the development cycle. And then because it's disconnected, business people, product owners and designers don't know about how fast the development cycle can actually work. So every delay in development then does have an effect on stacking up more piles and
leverage.
Exactly.
Yeah, leverage.
And making the problem even worse.
Yeah.
And the only way for me to reduce that is to implement continuous delivery in the idea of the business idea, to make the product owners, the designers, part of the cycle together with the developers and the receiving end, like the clients. I don't know, it can be everything, but let's just call them clients. And if there's just one ticket or one set of tickets, which is circling around, and then you go to the next ones, day after day after day after day, then you reduce the backlog. Actually, this is, let's say, the only way I saw in my past, which was actually reducing the problem with the backlog. And I think that was the question. I hope that was the answer for the question. Yeah.
And sort of, I want to tie it back up because we're going into sort of CD and DevOps topics, but I wanted to sort of breach this concept because this is the crucial part. You cannot do TDD well without this functioning. You need this feedback loop in order to start with step 0 or step 1 of writing your tests and thinking about thinking about your behavior, not about the design, the functionality, the business requirements from the customer's perspective, not about implementation. Like, this whole spiel doesn't work. It is not an engineering, it is not a coding problem to solve. If you're a coder and you're doing TDD, you're in a hopeless mess because it is a business problem. And I would still recommend you do TDD because from my experience, TDD gives you the fastest and most painful signal that this dysfunction exists in your company if it does.
And maybe one aspect we have not really talked about is how much you actually think about a problem before you actually start to code. And I think this is most often something we forgot.
Is it something that can be generalized?
Yes.
Okay.
I think so. I'll try. One common objection I hear to TDD, I don't know why it's common because it kind of blows my mind, is TDD only works for problems you understand before you start coding them. And the idea being, like, if I know I have to write an implementation for this API or something, it's really, or the Fibonacci calculator, I already know the outcomes before I start. Why this blows my mind is if you don't know what problem you're trying to solve before you start writing your code, why are you writing code in the first place? So if you're of the mindset that TDD only works if I know what problem I'm trying to solve, that's kind of the point. You should know what problem you're trying to solve before you start writing your code.
I heard this take in a different form, which is it's silly to write a test for code that doesn't exist yet, right? So like, how can I write a test if I haven't written it yet? But I think that's a dysfunction that focuses on the person who says this is assuming that TDD will be testing the implementation, which is not the case. We're supposed to write a test that will test the business understanding of what the code, of the solution that the code provides. Now, the implementation details might be up to interpretation to the engineer. Like that's the whole point. And sometimes you're just stuck in the middle. Like, you don't know enough about the problem that you're solving, and you don't really know how to implement it exactly without doing some exploratory steps. And that's where a lot of people I see just stop, just give up, and they say, okay, I'm just gonna do my normal thing, which is slow and error-prone debugging.
One thing I love about TDD is it makes that exploratory phase so much easier.
Yeah.
Because I have a test that tells me as soon as my exploration lands on the solution.
Yeah.
So I don't really understand the idea. So I mean, there are types of coding I would not do TDD for. If I'm learning a new language and I'm just following a book and I'm just trying random things to see, what does this function do in Python or whatever I'm learning? Yeah, I'm not going to do TDD for that. But that's the same way. Like if I move to a new city and I just want to see what the neighborhood's like, I'm going to go walk or drive around aimlessly without a destination in mind. That's fine if that's the goal. But if I'm trying to be productive, I want a destination in mind, and I want to know I'm trying to go to Walmart or wherever I'm going, and I'll know when I get there because I see a sign that says Walmart.
Yeah.
Who would avoiding TDD because you don't know the solution yet is like saying I'm going to go to the supermarket. Well, maybe I don't know where I'm going to get in the car and drive somewhere, and maybe I'll get somewhere productive and do something useful when I get there. That's kind of ridiculous, when you think about it like that.
And when you basically write a test afterwards, so let's take this example. So you say, okay, now I'm not in Walmart, I'm now in Aldi, for example. You end up in Aldi. Then you write a test, I'm in Aldi. Okay, then basically you missed the point of TDD and requirement and software development and making your client happy. Because the idea was to find out, did you need to go to Walmart before you start to drive? And not write a test about the destination you receive. Because those tests will always be green. And this the point is that, let's say, especially, let's say, static classes, static functions, they never change. So you don't write the test to make sure, in first place at least, to make sure that this function is working still in 2 years. It's most likely will be, even in today's world with linters, let's say TypeScript, for example, is a good example. You already have those helper tools which make sure that those functions will continue to work. So the idea of TDD is not only about keeping that functioning, it's about knowing what to write. And this is, I think, the reason why you said in the beginning that TDD is actually a misleading term. So people think too much about the practice of testing code. It is more about the when you start to make sure what to test. So this is more about
order to the degree that maybe there's decisions to be made, that there is an important decisions to be made about in what order to test things, or perhaps not even the order in which to test them. But usually there is a +1 problem, and I'm aware we're slightly over time, but I just want to finish up this idea, because this is as close to implementation as we get. Usually there's a +1 problem. It's like a +1 problem is something of the nature of, if I do this action, will I then write a test to do an action after this one happens? Right. So I test whether this works, and then if I know that works, I will do something that naturally occurs after that. That is a very dysfunctional way of testing, because you're building up a system where each test is essentially a line of code, right? So your tests have an order, and each test is a line of code in that order. So you're lacking encapsulation when that happens. Right? So the whole point is you should be able to describe the last step in that test, and that is the only test you need. But perhaps it is designed in such a way that it is actually not easy to express that one behavior in one line of code without you writing 10 lines of code in the test suite itself.
The Go test suite has a really cool flag called shuffle equals on.
Yes.
I just did a video about it. So it randomizes the test order to help ensure against this.
So you don't do this +1 thing, because a lot of people say, oh, this is really complicated. I need to write an end-to-end test, and I will write one end-to-end test by writing 15 unit tests and then run them in order.
Yeah.
That is a huge dysfunction. And that's the point of TDD, is that happens. TDD exposes that, hey, this is happening to you because you're testing implementation. You know the 10 lines of code that are happening, and you're writing a test for each one of those lines of code.
You can still do that with TDD. I mean, you could write your first test, see it fail, add your code, it passes. Then you go add another assertion to the same test, it fails. You go fix your, you could still have that happen in TDD. I don't think TDD is going to magically prevent you from doing that. Hopefully it'll make you uncomfortable and you'll find ways to solve it. But you have to be intentional too. You have to just know you have to learn how to write good tests. It doesn't, TDD is not going to magically, put that in your brain.
Mm-hmm.
So we hit the 2 hours marker.
We did.
Do we want to just thinking about, do we or have we covered everything? So from the agenda, I think we did, right?
I think so, yeah. We covered the greenfield versus brownfield. We covered the impact on engineering culture and automation, and specifically about the discussion about delivery and customer feedback and QA, and the links between testing culture and well-being. I think we covered. I think at least we covered on our promise on the agenda.
Yes, and I had this poll I was talking about running, and I quickly refreshed the page, but there were, let's say, 33 votes until this, I don't know, morning. And the interesting part is that most of the participants use TDD regularly. That's interesting.
Yeah. I think that's bias. I had to call that out as well in my newsletter post, that is
you
bias.
are
That is
more likely
my-
to say yes if you're using it and not no. But yes,
Yes. Also,
It
my
is-
followers are, like 60% of my newsletter followers are Kent audience, and they will be more TDD prone.
yeah,
So
it's
I just have to.
still 12 said, which is still a significant number that they don't use TDD, and 6 said with challenges, and one other comment, yes, but that's actually interesting. So I would have suggested, because I had that already. One more, I think one time in the past I asked about that, and most of the people weren't using TDD. So this is basically vice versa now. Of course, this is not very representative. Of course, it's audience, it's followership, and all this kind of stuff. But it's still interesting to see that many people using it, because let's say my awareness is more like, or what I see is more like that the people try to avoid TDD. So when I read on LinkedIn about this stuff, it is more like I have the feeling that I see more enemies of TDD than I actually
That's
see
a social
practitioners.
media, Twitter problem, Reddit problem. Like that's a vitriol with the flame war source rather than it actually being practical. I think the practitioners won't engage in those flame wars unless they like want the emotional response of just being part of a flame war. I don't think that's worth engaging into. Adrian, did you freeze? Adrian? 1212? Yeah, so it seems Adrian has crashed or at least frozen. So, Jonathan, anything else from your end regarding TDD?
I just wanted to comment on the results of his informal poll. I think it's worth focusing on those who are challenged by TDD. If people aren't using TDD, that's their choice. I might disagree, but that's okay. But those who are challenged by it, those are the ones I think we need to focus on as a community, to help them address those challenges and find ways to be successful with this practice that they're learning and apparently hoping to be successful with.
And Jeff has a great question on this. It's like, why would someone listen to a 2-hour podcast on TDD if they're sure that TDD is not worth using? And my response to something like this would be like that assumption stack regarding you are sure that it's not worth using. It's probably there for a reason, but it's not permanent. It has a context. It has a certain reason why it's not worth using right now. I usually ask people, is it the right time? Is it the right place? Is it the right methodology for the current context of a project? And I would always refer judgment to if it's not the right thing to use TDD right now, when will it be the right time? Like, what are the consequences of us not using TDD? What are the benefits of us not using TDD? Right. So as a TDD practitioner, it's very hard for me to find reasons why TDD would be harmful to adopt, unless you're constantly stuck in a type of project where well-being is a low priority. So you're constantly under stress, you're constantly under anxiety, you're constantly under time pressure, you're constantly late, you're constantly bugs and defects after deployment. Now, those are concerns that 3D doesn't fix, but it does prevent them. You just need to figure out, are you in the business of fixing them and preventing them, or just fixing them? Right? So if you already leave a mess, did you make your triage system of hiring a cleaning lady and cleaning up afterwards a priority? Because that's where your money is going. And perhaps that's the only money you have. So you can only fix, but not do prevention. Right? This is also back to that gym analogy and the nutrition analogy. Maybe you don't have time to do prevention and fixing. Maybe you only have time for fixing. But my suggestion would be is that you should learn about TDD. So you should learn about prevention, so that the moment you have a little bit of gap, a little bit of leeway in your timing, in your budget, you immediately over prioritize the prevention. So the moment you have to stop, the moment you can afford to stop, to let go of fixing things, so that you immediately shift your focus over to prevention. If you're just so busy with fixing, that you don't learn TDD, then the moment you don't need to fix anything, you don't know what prevention looks like. So that would be my advice. Like, why would someone listen to a 2-hour podcast in TDD if they're sure that TDD is not worth using? I would say it's a matter of timing. Learn how to do prevention. Maybe not with TDD, but just do prevention. How to, be more agile. how to prevent the problems that are plaguing you, how to prevent the problems that are causing you to either in some way continuously experiencing the same kind of pain, slow down, quality problems. Anyway,
Good.
we're over.
So,
Welcome back, Adrian.
Jonathan, 2 questions to your side.
All right.
First of all, how can people reach you?
Well, the best way is at the corner pub. Buy me a drink. I'll be there in about a half an hour. If that's a little far away, then my website is boldlygo.tech. I have a daily email about the Go language. I have a YouTube channel about Go, Boldly Go, and I work with Go people who need help with their Go development. I do TDD and Go as much as I can. So, yeah. And you can also find my contact details. If you have a question directly for me, you don't want to send it on email or whatever, that's fine. Just, you can find my contact details, send me a direct email or follow me on LinkedIn or Mastodon. Those links are all there too.
Awesome.
Great. And the second one, yeah. And the second one is, do you have some picks or like a pick of the day thing regarding TDD? So you're quite experienced in that area. So what would you suggest for people listening to this stream to read, listen to, or, about TDD?
So let me pull up a post I wrote about this a while back. I mean, the sort of the go-to answer I think a lot of people use is the test-driven development by example from Kent Beck. That's sort of the original book. It's not my favorite book on the topic. It's not a bad book. Don't get me wrong. It's about the mechanics of it more than anything else, though. Personally, the book that had the biggest impact on my career, probably in general, as well as specifically on TDD, was Working Effectively with Legacy Code by Michael Feathers. And he has a new one out, or coming out very soon. I can't recall. I think it's more Working Effectively with Legacy Code or similar. I'm eager to read that one whenever I can get my hands on it. So that's probably, as far as books, that's the one I would recommend. I would also really encourage people to watch Dave Farley's YouTube channel, Continuous Delivery, which isn't specifically about TDD, but that's part of it. That's one part of the bigger whole. And he talks about a lot of the topics we talked about today. He has a great video about why you shouldn't do end-to-end testing, for example, which came to mind with that question. But yeah, so for books, Michael Feathers' book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code. Again, it's not specifically about TDD, but it is about how to write tests and legacy code bases, which goes hand in hand. And then Dave Farley's channel or his books also are great.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sounds great.
Great suggestions.
Good.
I can do a +1 on Michael Feathers' book. Like it's one of my staples as well. Like Kent Beck's book, like TDD by example, it's more a tutorial on how to use XUnit kind of frameworks while also doing TDD, and I think it sort of misses the mark on what TDD really.
You know what?
It's a good book. It just it's very easy for you to misinterpret what the important thing is. By reading.
I might add one more recommendation for the sort of cultural aspect. If you're already sold on TDD, but you're not sure how to convince your team or your manager what to do, a book that could help with that sort of thing is called Driving Technical Change by Terrence Ryan. It's from the Programmatic Programmer series. Driving Technical Change: Why People on Your Team Don't Act on Good Ideas and How to Convince Them that They Should. So it's a great one, whether it's TDD or adopting that new React framework that came out yesterday or whatever it is that you think is the great idea that your team isn't convinced on. This is a book to really help you make that case.
Interesting. I want to read that one because this is
know
always
about
one
it.
of the most. It is one of the most interesting topics overall. How to convince people, because the best ideas are worthless. It's not the entire team or culture. It's actually practicing that.
Yep.
Great, thank you very much, Dennis. You have any mentions? So because you are a TDD coach as well, right?
Yeah, I think I wanted to mention just those two primarily, like Kent Beck's book and the one from Michael Feathers, Working Effectively with Legacy Code. Like you just need to know how to learn the craft and then how to introduce it into a brownfield project. Like any kind of example or kata that allows you to do TDD in a greenfield project, but then not know what to do in a brownfield project is not useful, right? So that's 90% of what I'm coaching. It's just teaching people how to sort of deal with their brownfield problems, because they're not in isolation. They're not in a clean test harness. So, and they don't know how to get there. So for me, that was the biggest thing. I'm looking forward to reading this book and perhaps even adding it to the list on the book club. Yeah. I mean, it's very helpful to understand the business side of testing. Perhaps not TDD itself, but the business side of writing tests as soon as possible. So I'm not a big fan of calling it red green refactor. I think that really misses the mark. But you want to be able to reason about your code in behavior terms. So about things that people do, act, the messages they send, not about the implementation of it. So the sort of more Puritan aspect of object-oriented programming, if you follow Igor, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Hang on, Bugayenko, Yegor Bugayenko and Kevin Henney. They are like really strong on the philosophy of just naming things well and object orientation. I would say that's a very good start if you don't know how to separate out behavior from implementation, because that's the abstraction idea of test writing that really gets a lot of engineers stuck.
Good. So we will create. Sorry, go ahead.
So I like your point that red-green refactor kind of misses the mark. I like to say that it's similar to describing riding a bicycle as pushing down with your right foot than pushing down with your left foot.
Yeah.
It's technically right, but it doesn't really tell you anything useful.
Yeah, like because for me, what helped with bicycle riding is that somebody told me just look at where you want to go.
Yeah.
Because I was looking at my feet. Right. So the moment when I started looking where I want to go, everything fixed itself.
Yeah.
But it wasn't about pedaling. It wasn't about balance. It wasn't about me looking down and being worried about what I hit once I fall.
Exactly.
Because I was focusing on what happens if I do it incorrectly. Yeah. And I was never really looking at where I'm going because it's a mode of transportation. Same thing applies for dancing. Same thing applies for salsa. Same thing applies for Jonathan. You also used to be a very avid salsa dancer, right? So it's about where you're headed. It's about the journey you're about to have with your partner, not so much about what are the steps, what is the music, what beat am I on.
Exactly.
Right? So same thing with TDD. It's like, well, where are we headed? Where's the product headed? Focus on that, not red green refactor. It's just am I doing the process correctly? Am I doing the process correctly?
It's not actionable. Yeah,
it's not actionable. This idea that you're doing TDD wrong is nonsense. Like it's not even important. The point is whether you understand the concept of what problem are we solving with TDD. That's what's important.
So I just displayed Jeff Grigg's comment one more time because he was providing us so many comments today. So I think it's fair to just display his last one as well. But okay, great. So thank you everyone today, especially Jonathan Hall and the audience. You were so great today. Great communications, asynchronous communications. I think it was a great show. It was, let's say, that one with the most overtime we had until now.
We're all passionate about this topic. So
yeah, I think we could even go on, but I think when we take a look at the numbers
we can always do another one another time.
We can always do another one. Yeah.
And what I wanted to just say is I wanted to give a recommendation when it comes to Jonathan Hall. Unfortunately, not the tiny DevOps stuff anymore, but Adventures in DevOps is still there. So if you want to listen to, it's now 148 episodes. He's part of the team who's doing Adventures in DevOps podcast. You find that basically on your podcast platform. It's a great one to listen to. I really they talk about those things like today as well. Really recommend this one. Good. So I would say we're closing with that one. And thank you very much, everyone. And yes, see you next time then, which is next week, Wednesday.
Yes.
And
you might not see me until next year, but we need to figure out the schedule still.
We buy you a Starlink antenna, and then
you buy me a Starlink, and then okay. Okay, Jonathan, again.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Audience, see you next time.
So some elevator music, and goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.